Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in and let's begin. The rope creaked like an old rocking chair as the desert wind pushed her 7-foot frame back and forth beneath the saloon's weathered sign, while Julien Beaumont's exhausted horse stopped dead in the middle of what had once been the main street of Perdition Wells, its nostrils flaring at the scent of death and decay that hung over the abandoned town like a burial shroud. The woman hanging there was enormous, not just tall but powerfully built, with shoulders that could have carried the weight of the world and hands that even in death seemed capable of crushing skulls or caressing hearts with equal ease, while her long auburn hair caught the late afternoon sun like copper wire against the bleached bones of the ghost town. The sign nailed to the post beneath her dangling boots was written in fresh paint that hadn't had time to fade under the relentless Nevada sun, its blood-red letters spelling out words that made Julian's stomach clench with recognition of a message meant for men like him who rode the frontier alone. No man rides free. The crude wooden placard swayed in the same rhythm as her body, creating a macabre dance that spoke of recent violence and systematic cruelty that exceeded normal frontier justice, while the precision of the knots and the careful positioning of the corpse suggested this was execution rather than murder, punishment rather than crime. Julien dismounted with the careful movements of someone whose body carried the accumulated damage of 35 years spent in saddles and saloons, his weathered hands shaking not from age but from exhaustion that had been building for months as he fled from memories that followed him like wolves tracking wounded prey. His approach to the hanging woman was cautious, as frontier experience had taught him that scenes like this were often bait for traps set by outlaws who used horror to freeze their victims while positioning themselves for ambush attacks that left more bodies for the buzzards circling overhead. The closer inspection that his conscience demanded revealed details that challenged his assumptions about what he was witnessing, as the woman's clothes were those of a saloon girl, but made from fabric too fine for frontier establishments, while her jewelry suggested wealth that exceeded anything dance hall workers could accumulate through normal employment in territories where survival consumed most of what little money was available. Her face, even in death, carried aristocratic features that spoke of breeding and education, while her hands showed calluses that indicated familiarity with hard work, despite their obvious capability for gentleness that death had permanently stolen from the world. The sound of approaching hoofbeats from the direction he had come sent ice through his veins as he realized that his pursuit by men whose patience with his continued existence had finally been exhausted might have led him into trap that would end his flight permanently. While the setting sun was casting shadows that could conceal armed men whose presence would be revealed only when bullets started flying from positions that his exhaustion had prevented him from scouting properly. When he turned to see 3 riders emerging from the heat shimmer that distorted the horizon like ripples on water, Julien understood that his discovery of the hanged woman might be the last sight his eyes would ever register, as the men approaching had the look of killers whose business in Perdition Wells involved more than simple coincidence. 3 weeks earlier, the poker game in Silver City's grandest saloon had been going Julien's way until the moment when his natural luck collided with Armand Delacroix's systematic cheating, creating the kind of confrontation that ended either in apologies or graveyards, depending on the character of the men involved, and their willingness to let money disputes destroy lives that could be preserved through honest conversation about mathematical probabilities and card manipulation techniques. Delacroix's reputation as a professional gambler whose success was built on skills that exceeded mere chance was balanced by his known ruthlessness toward anyone who challenged his methods or questioned his integrity in ways that could damage the carefully constructed persona that allowed him to operate in respectable establishments. The accusation that Julien made was delivered quietly and without theatrics. But its content, a detailed explanation of how marked cards and coordinated signals were being used to redistribute wealth from honest players to criminal conspirators, was specific enough to prove knowledge that exceeded lucky guessing while also demonstrating observation skills that made him dangerous to operations that depended on victims remaining ignorant of methods being used to rob them systematically. Delacroix's response was immediate and predictable. As his hand moved toward the pearl-handled Colt that had ended the lives of 17 men whose inconvenient honesty had threatened profitable criminal enterprises throughout 3 territories. The gunfight that erupted in the crowded saloon was brief and decisive, with Julien's frontier-trained reflexes proving faster than the professional killer's practiced draw, while the bullet that dropped Delacroix to the sawdust-covered floor also eliminated the source of corruption that had been poisoning Silver City's gaming establishments for months. The silence that followed the gunshot was broken by cheers from honest players who had been systematically robbed, but their celebration was tempered by recognition that killing Armand Delacroix meant declaring war on the criminal network that had been using him as their primary source of gambling revenue throughout territorial Nevada. The warning that came from Delacroix's dying lips was delivered with the kind of malicious satisfaction that evil men reserved for moments when their death could still cause suffering to people whose honesty had been their downfall. As his revelation that bounties had already been placed on the heads of anyone who interfered with their operations made clear that Julien's survival depended on immediate flight from territory, where staying meant facing assassination by professionals whose skills exceeded anything single gunfighters could match through individual courage or superior marksmanship. The escape from Silver City was accomplished through back streets and mountain trails that Julien's years of frontier living had taught him to navigate in darkness, while the sound of pursuit that began before dawn indicated that Delacroix's criminal associates were both numerous and determined to make examples of people whose interference with their business operations couldn't be tolerated without encouraging additional resistance from honest citizens who might mistake his survival for weakness. When he realized that the men following him included some of the territory's most feared bounty hunters and professional killers, Julien understood that his flight had become a race where the prize for losing was death, while the reward for winning was nothing more than temporary postponement of inevitable confrontation with forces whose resources exceeded anything individual resistance could overcome. Perdition Wells had died the way most frontier towns died. Slowly and painfully, as the silver mine that had created prosperity for 500 souls was exhausted by corporate greed that prioritized maximum extraction over sustainable development. Leaving behind environmental devastation and economic collapse that forced families to abandon homes they had built with hopes that had been crushed beneath the weight of external forces beyond their control. The town's decline had been accelerated by water disputes and territorial politics that favored outside investors over local residents whose rights were secondary to profit margins that determined policy decisions made in distant boardrooms by men who never saw the faces of people whose lives were destroyed by their financial calculations. The last residents had left 2 years earlier when the final business, Murphy's General Store, closed its doors after the owner's death from consumption that inadequate medical care had failed to prevent, while his widow's inability to maintain operations without help that was unavailable in a community where population had dwindled below the threshold necessary for economic viability. The abandonment had been total and systematic. As families took everything portable while leaving behind only what was too heavy or worthless to justify the expense of transportation to places where new beginnings might be possible for people whose skills and determination could find opportunities in communities that still had futures. The reputation that Perdition Wells had acquired during its final months was darker than simple economic failure. As reports of strange occurrences and violent incidents had reached territorial authorities through sources whose credibility was questioned, but whose consistency suggested that something more than normal frontier hardship was driving people away from a place that had become synonymous with bad luck and unnatural dangers. The stories that circulated in saloons and trading posts included accounts of giant women who appeared in the desert like mirages, demanding payment from men whose crimes against their people had created debts that conventional justice couldn't address through legal procedures that ignored systematic oppression and exploitation. The investigation that Territorial Marshal Jake Harrison had conducted 6 months earlier had uncovered evidence of organized violence against travelers whose only crime was being in the wrong place when debts were being collected through methods that exceeded legal authority, but which seemed to follow patterns that suggested systematic justice rather than random criminal activity. His report had mentioned discoveries of bodies that showed signs of execution rather than murder, while the positioning and treatment of corpses indicated ritualistic elements that were foreign to conventional frontier violence, but which seemed to follow consistent rules that governed when and how justice was administered. The warning that Harrison had posted in territorial newspapers advised travelers to avoid Perdition Wells due to unexplained dangers that territorial law enforcement was unable to address through conventional methods, while his recommendation that the area be declared off-limits until federal investigation could determine the source of threats reflected his recognition that local authority was inadequate for dealing with problems that exceeded normal frontier lawlessness. When Julien remembered reading that warning in a Silver City saloon 3 months earlier, his decision to seek refuge in a place that others avoided seemed like survival strategy rather than suicide pact. But his discovery of the hanged woman suggested that Perdition Wells' reputation for danger was based on realities that made his pursuit by bounty hunters seem like minor threat compared to whatever forces were administering justice according to rules that no living man understood. The search of the woman's body, that Julien's conscience demanded despite his urgent need to escape pursuit, revealed personal items that challenged every assumption about her identity and circumstances, as the leather pouch hidden beneath her corset contained not the few coins that saloon girls typically carried, but rather letters written in French that spoke of education and refinement, while also revealing a story of tragedy that had driven someone of obvious quality into frontier exile, where death had finally found her. The correspondence was addressed to Madame Isabelle Rousseau and signed by family members whose concerns about her welfare were expressed in language that indicated aristocratic background and European connections that seemed impossible for someone whose final moments had been spent hanging from a rope in a Nevada ghost town. The photographs that were carefully wrapped in oiled cloth showed Isabelle in elegant clothing surrounded by people whose faces suggested wealth and social position that contradicted her presence in Perdition Wells, while the dates written on the backs indicated that her transformation from European lady to frontier outcast had occurred within the past 2 years. Her beauty in the portraits was conventional and refined, making her unusual size and powerful build seem like cruel tricks of fate that had marked her as different in societies where conformity to feminine ideals was essential for social acceptance and economic security that marriage provided to women whose independence was limited by laws and customs that treated them as property rather than people. The diary entries that filled a small leather-bound journal provided glimpses into a mind that combined intelligence with desperation, as her careful handwriting described the systematic persecution that had driven her from France to America, while also documenting the series of betrayals and disappointments that had led her into increasingly desperate circumstances where survival required choices that decent people were never supposed to face. Her account of the arranged marriage that had brought her to America revealed family pressures that had forced her into union with a man whose cruelty was hidden beneath social respectability. while her descriptions of abuse that had escalated from emotional manipulation to physical violence painted pictures of domestic hell that law and society ignored when victims were women whose complaints were dismissed as hysteria or disloyalty. The escape that had brought her to the frontier was described in entries that revealed courage that exceeded anything her aristocratic upbringing had prepared her for, as her decision to flee from husband and family had required abandoning everything familiar and safe for unknown dangers that seemed preferable to continued submission to violence that was destroying her soul as well as her body. Her transformation from protected lady to independent woman had been accomplished through work that utilized her size and strength in ways that civilization had never permitted, while her discovery that she could defend herself and others had awakened capabilities that proper education had systematically suppressed in favor of helplessness that made women dependent on male protection. The final entries in her diary described her arrival in Perdition Wells and her decision to use the abandoned saloon as refuge, where she could hide from pursuit while planning her next move toward territory where her past couldn't follow and her future might include possibilities for peace that had been absent from her life since childhood had ended and adult responsibilities had begun. Her last written words expressed hope that the ghost town's reputation for danger might provide protection from the bounty hunters who had been hired by her husband to retrieve property that he considered stolen when she had liberated herself from bondage that marriage contracts had made legally binding, regardless of personal cost or moral considerations about human dignity and individual rights. The three riders who emerged from the desert heat were led by Marcus Kane, a bounty hunter whose reputation for finding people who didn't want to be found was balanced by his complete lack of interest in whether his targets were guilty of anything beyond inconveniencing wealthy clients, whose money was more important than justice or mercy in territories where law enforcement was sparse and federal oversight was practically non-existent. His companions were professionals whose skills had been proven through years of tracking fugitives across terrain that defeated lesser men. While their obvious confidence and systematic approach to surrounding Perdition Wells indicated experience with situations where targets might choose fight over flight when cornered in places where escape was impossible. Kane's assessment of the situation revealed tactical thinking that had been developed through military service and refined through civilian application, in circumstances where mistakes meant death for hunters who underestimated their prey. While his immediate recognition of Julien as the primary target was balanced by curiosity about the hanging woman whose presence suggested complications that hadn't been mentioned in the bounty descriptions provided by clients whose information was typically incomplete or deliberately misleading to prevent interference from law enforcement or competing hunters whose success would reduce their profits. The positioning that Kane's team adopted was designed to prevent escape while maintaining fields of fire that could eliminate resistance through coordinated action if negotiation failed to produce surrender. While their obvious preparation for extended siege indicated resources and patience that most bounty hunters couldn't afford to invest in single targets, whose value didn't justify expensive operations. Their knowledge of Perdition Wells's layout and the strategic advantages that various buildings provided demonstrated advanced scouting that had been conducted by professionals whose success depended on information superiority and tactical preparation rather than luck or superior firepower alone. The signal that passed between the hunters was subtle but unmistakable to anyone whose survival had depended on reading hostile intentions, while their simultaneous movement toward predetermined positions created crossfire coverage that made the saloon where Julien had taken shelter into potential death trap rather than defensive position. His recognition that escape would require either eliminating all three hunters or creating diversions that allowed him to reach his horse before pursuit could be organized led to calculations about odds that were unfavorable, regardless of which tactical option he chose for dealing with professionals whose skills exceeded his own. despite his frontier experience and natural talent for survival in hostile situations. The voice that called out from the street below carried Kane's characteristic mixture of professional courtesy and implicit threat, as his offer to discuss terms for surrender was delivered with the kind of calm confidence that men developed when they held overwhelming advantages and were willing to use them if reasonable negotiation was rejected by targets whose stubbornness would only increase the cost of inevitable capture. When he mentioned that clients were willing to pay extra for live delivery, but that dead was acceptable if circumstances required lethal force to complete contracts, Julien understood that his choices had been reduced to surrender that might mean survival or resistance that would definitely mean death, while the hanged woman above him served as reminder that some fates were worse than dying with dignity intact. The conversation that developed between hunter and hunted was conducted through shouted exchanges that revealed more than either man intended about their respective positions and motivations. As Kane's questions about Julien's presence in Perdition Wells demonstrated curiosity that exceeded simple professional interest, while his observations about the hanging woman suggested knowledge of local conditions that hadn't been included in bounty specifications provided by clients whose agenda might be more complex than simple debt collection or criminal apprehension. Julien's responses were carefully neutral, but his growing awareness of tactical options that the abandoned town provided created possibilities for survival that hadn't existed when he first discovered himself surrounded by professional killers. The negotiation that Kane attempted was complicated by his recognition that conventional bounty hunting procedures were inadequate for dealing with situations where clients had provided incomplete information about local conditions and potential complications that could affect successful completion of contracts, while his growing unease about the hanged woman's presence suggested that Perdition Wells's reputation for danger was based on realities that threatened hunters as well as their targets. His offer to split bounty payments in exchange for information about recent events in the ghost town was refused by Julien, whose frontier instincts warned that cooperation with bounty hunters typically led to betrayal once their immediate objectives were achieved. The discovery that changed everything came when Kane's systematic search of the town revealed evidence of recent habitation by multiple people whose presence hadn't been reported by informants whose surveillance was supposed to prevent surprises that could complicate hunting operations, while tracks around the saloon indicated that Isabelle hadn't been alone when death had claimed her. The signs of struggle that were visible to experienced trackers suggested that her execution had been preceded by conflict that had involved several participants, while the absence of additional bodies raised questions about the fate of people whose survival might create witnesses to events that someone wanted to remain secret. The ambush that struck Kane's team came without warning from positions that hadn't been scouted because they were supposed to be impossible for human occupation, as rifle fire from rooftops and windows that appeared structurally unsound created crossfire that demonstrated tactical coordination by opponents whose knowledge of Perdition Wells exceeded anything maps or previous reconnaissance had provided. The accuracy of shooting that dropped one hunter immediately while wounding another indicated marksmanship skills that exceeded normal frontier capabilities, while the discipline that prevented premature revelation of all firing positions suggested military training or extensive experience with guerrilla warfare techniques. The retreat that Kane ordered was accomplished under covering fire that allowed his wounded companion to reach safety behind buildings that provided protection from continued assault, while his recognition that they were facing opponents whose capabilities exceeded anything bounty hunting had prepared them for led to tactical reassessment that prioritized survival over contract completion. When silence returned to Perdition Wells, and Julien realized that he was no longer the primary target of whatever forces were controlling the ghost town, his relief was tempered by understanding that his rescue had come from people whose motivations and intentions were completely unknown, but whose methods suggested that death was still the most likely outcome for everyone present when their business was concluded. The voice that called out from the abandoned hotel was feminine and carried accents that suggested French origins, while its owner's command for all armed men to lay down their weapons and approach the saloon with hands visible was delivered with authority that expected immediate compliance rather than negotiation about terms or conditions for safe passage through territory that was obviously under hostile control. The woman who emerged from concealment was enormous, easily 7 feet tall with the kind of muscular build that indicated both natural size and systematic physical development that exceeded anything normal frontier life produced. While her clothing combined practical frontier gear with decorative elements that suggested wealth and social position that contradicted her presence in a Nevada ghost town. The companions who joined her in the street were equally impressive in size and bearing, creating the kind of overwhelming physical presence that made conventional resistance seem futile, regardless of numerical advantages or superior firepower that opponents might possess. While their obvious coordination and military discipline demonstrated training that exceeded anything territorial militia or frontier law enforcement typically achieved through irregular practice and limited resources. Their weapons were not the standard firearms that frontier women carried for protection, but rather specialized equipment that suggested both wealth and access to advanced technology that wasn't available through normal commercial channels in remote territories. The interrogation that followed was conducted with efficiency that indicated extensive experience with extracting information from reluctant subjects, while the questions that were directed at Kane revealed knowledge of bounty hunting operations and criminal networks that suggested intelligence-gathering capabilities that exceeded anything local law enforcement possessed. The revelation that the giant women knew details about Delacroix's criminal enterprise and the circumstances that had led to Julien's flight created implications that his situation was more complex than simple pursuit by hired killers seeking to collect debts owed to dead gamblers. The explanation that was provided by the apparent leader, who introduced herself as Captain Marie Dubois, revealed that Isabelle's death had been part of systematic campaign against giant women whose existence was viewed as threat to established social order by powerful interests whose influence extended throughout territorial government and business communities. The execution that Julien had discovered was intended as warning to others of her kind, while also serving as bait for trap that would eliminate additional targets whose continued survival challenged assumptions about human nature and social organization that conventional authority required for maintaining control over populations that might otherwise question legitimacy of existing power structures. The choice that was offered to Julien was simple, but carried implications that extended far beyond his immediate survival, as cooperation with the giant women's resistance movement would provide protection from bounty hunters, while also involving him in conflict against forces whose resources and political connections exceeded anything individual rebellion could overcome through conventional means. When Captain Dubois explained that his skills as gunfighter and his knowledge of criminal networks made him valuable ally in war that was already being fought, whether he participated or not, Julien faced decision that would determine not only his own fate, but his role in struggle that was larger than personal survival or individual justice. The story that Captain Dubois revealed during their evening meeting in the saloon's private room painted a picture of systematic persecution that had been hidden from public knowledge through media control and government cooperation with commercial interests whose expansion plans required elimination of obstacles that couldn't be removed through legal procedures or conventional business negotiations. The giant women, she explained, were not anomalies or freaks, but rather members of an ancient race whose existence had been concealed from ordinary humans through centuries of careful isolation and protective secrecy that technological advancement and territorial expansion were making impossible to maintain. The persecution that had scattered her people throughout the frontier territories was being conducted by mining companies and railroad corporations whose development projects were threatened by environmental protections that giant communities had maintained through traditional knowledge and spiritual practices that recognized natural resources as sacred heritage, rather than commodities to be extracted for profit without regard for long-term consequences. The systematic elimination campaign that had claimed Isabelle's life was designed to remove witnesses and protectors whose testimony could expose environmental crimes that violated federal law, while also destroying communities whose alternative approaches to development challenged corporate assumptions about progress and civilization. The network that was coordinating attacks against giant populations included territorial officials whose corruption had been purchased through campaign contributions and direct bribes, while federal authorities were kept ignorant of systematic persecution through falsified reports and jurisdictional complications that prevented effective investigation or intervention. The bounty hunters who were being employed for elimination operations were told that their targets were dangerous criminals whose capture or death was essential for public safety, while the true nature of their victims was concealed through documentation that portrayed peaceful communities as violent threats requiring military-style response. The evidence that Captain Dubois possessed included correspondence between corporate executives and territorial officials that documented planning for what amounted to genocide, while her people's survival depended on exposing criminal conspiracy through methods that legal authorities either couldn't or wouldn't pursue due to political pressure and financial influence that made prosecution impossible through conventional channels. The photographs and documents that she showed Julien revealed scope of criminal activity that exceeded anything frontier lawlessness had previously encompassed, involving systematic murder and environmental destruction on scales that required federal intervention to prevent completion of plans that would eliminate entire populations while destroying natural heritage that belonged to future generations. The proposal that emerged from their conversation was revolutionary in its scope and dangerous in its implications, as Captain Dubois outlined strategy for gathering evidence and exposing conspiracy through methods that would require infiltrating criminal networks while building alliances with honest officials whose careers would be destroyed if their cooperation became known to corrupt colleagues. When she asked whether Julien's hatred of Delacroix's criminal organization extended to willingness to risk everything for justice that exceeded personal revenge, his answer would determine whether her people's struggle would gain an ally whose skills and connections could provide access to information that her own intelligence network couldn't obtain through conventional surveillance methods. The journey to the hidden community, where surviving giant families had established refuge, was accomplished through desert terrain that seemed impossible to navigate without detailed knowledge of water sources and safe passages that weren't marked on any territorial maps, while the route itself was protected by natural obstacles and defensive positions that could be held by small numbers of defenders against overwhelming attacks by conventional military forces. The caves that served as temporary homes were surprisingly comfortable and well organized, demonstrating engineering skills that exceeded anything frontier communities had achieved through individual effort and limited resources. The reception that Julien received from community members ranged from cautious acceptance to open hostility, as his presence represented security risk that could compromise carefully maintained secrecy if his loyalty proved unreliable or if capture by enemies provided opportunities for torture that might reveal locations and defensive capabilities that survival depended on, keeping secret from authorities whose response to discovery would involve immediate military action. The children who watched him with mixture of curiosity and fear had never seen normal-sized humans except as threats to be avoided or enemies to be eliminated when confrontation became unavoidable. The council meeting that was convened to discuss his integration into their resistance activities revealed decision-making processes that combined democratic participation with military efficiency, while the debates about tactical options and strategic priorities demonstrated intellectual capabilities that challenged stereotypes about primitive peoples whose technological development was assumed to be inferior to conventional civilization. The knowledge that emerged from their discussions included information about territorial politics and corporate activities that exceeded anything official sources had revealed, suggesting intelligence-gathering capabilities that professional law enforcement agencies would have envied. The training that began immediately was designed to prepare him for infiltration missions that would require skills beyond conventional gunfighting, as successful espionage against sophisticated opponents demanded abilities that frontier experience hadn't provided, while also requiring psychological preparation for situations where capture would mean torture and death not only for himself, but for communities whose locations might be revealed through methods that made heroic silence impossible to maintain. The weapons and equipment that were provided exceeded anything territorial law enforcement possessed, while their obvious quality and advanced design suggested manufacturing capabilities or supply networks that weren't available through normal commercial channels. The assignment that was finally proposed involved returning to Silver City and establishing contact with honest officials whose cooperation could provide legal framework for exposing conspiracy while also gathering evidence that could be used in federal court proceedings that might result in prosecution of corporate executives and territorial officials whose crimes had been protected through political influence and jurisdictional complications. When Captain Dubois explained that success would require maintaining cover identity as fugitive bounty hunter while secretly working to destroy criminal networks that had hired him, Julien understood that his survival would depend on acting skills that he had never needed before and loyalty to people whose trust he hadn't yet earned through actions that proved his commitment to justice exceeded personal safety. The transformation of Julien's appearance and identity was accomplished through careful attention to details that would convince casual observers while also providing background story that could withstand investigation by suspicious enemies whose survival depended on verifying credentials of potential allies or employees whose access to sensitive information could compromise operations if their loyalty was questionable. The documents that established his new identity as Jean-Baptiste Mercier were genuine federal papers that had been obtained through sources whose cooperation with giant intelligence networks remained secret despite their positions within territorial government, where discovery would mean immediate execution. The return to Silver City was accomplished through routes that avoided known bounty hunter patrol areas, while also providing opportunities to establish credible cover story about recent activities and current intentions that would explain his survival and continued presence in territory where death warrants had been issued by criminal organizations whose patience with interference was exhausted. The saloon where Delacroix had died was under new management that included security arrangements designed to prevent repetition of violent incidents that had damaged the establishment's reputation for providing safe entertainment for wealthy clients whose patronage was essential for profitable operations. The contact that was made with Deputy Marshal Frank Harrison was conducted through intermediaries whose trustworthiness had been verified through methods that exceeded normal background investigation, while the information that was shared about corporate conspiracy required careful presentation that wouldn't trigger jurisdictional disputes or bureaucratic complications that could prevent effective law enforcement response to evidence of federal crimes. Harrison's reputation for honesty was balanced by his limited authority and political vulnerability to pressure from territorial officials whose cooperation was essential for maintaining order in regions where federal oversight was minimal. The evidence that began accumulating through systematic investigation exceeded anything that normal law enforcement procedures could have gathered, as giant intelligence networks provided access to private communications and corporate planning documents that revealed scope of criminal conspiracy while also documenting specific instances of murder and environmental destruction that violated multiple federal laws. The challenge was presenting accumulated evidence in ways that would convince skeptical authorities while protecting sources whose exposure would result in immediate retaliation from criminal organizations whose resources included professional killers and corrupt officials. The breakthrough that made prosecution possible came when Harrison's investigation uncovered financial records that connected territorial officials with mining company executives through transactions that could only be explained as payment for illegal services. While the timing of these transfers corresponded exactly with documented attacks on giant communities whose resistance to development projects had been eliminated through systematic murder. When federal prosecutors agreed to review evidence that had been gathered through unofficial channels, both Julien and Captain Dubois understood that their alliance had created opportunities for justice that neither could have achieved through individual action. But success would require continued cooperation, despite dangers that were increasing as their activities attracted attention from enemies whose desperation was making them increasingly careless about maintaining legal pretenses for criminal activities. The federal grand jury that was secretly convened to review evidence of territorial corruption and corporate conspiracy included members whose integrity had been verified through background investigations that exceeded normal security procedures, while their isolation from local political pressure was maintained through location changes and security measures that reflected recognition of assassination risks that had eliminated previous witnesses whose testimony could have exposed criminal activities. The evidence that was presented exceeded anything federal prosecutors had encountered in territorial cases, involving systematic crimes that reached into congressional offices and federal agencies where corporate influence had been purchased through methods that violated multiple laws. The testimony that Julien provided about his personal experiences with Delacroix's criminal network was corroborated by financial records and communications that Captain Dubois had obtained through intelligence operations whose sophistication exceeded anything federal law enforcement had imagined possible for communities that were supposed to be primitive refugees hiding in desert caves. The combination of first-hand witness accounts and documentary evidence created prosecutorial framework that could result in convictions of major corporate executives and territorial officials whose crimes had been protected through political connections that were becoming liabilities rather than assets. The reaction to federal investigation was immediate and violent. As corporate security forces and hired killers began systematic elimination of potential witnesses, while territorial officials attempted to destroy records and intimidate grand jury members through threats that exceeded normal political pressure into territory involving federal crimes that made prosecution inevitable if evidence could be preserved and witnesses could be protected. The safe houses that were established for protecting cooperating witnesses required military-level security that demonstrated federal commitment to pursuing justice regardless of political costs or violent resistance from criminal organizations. The assassination attempt against Deputy Marshal Harrison was prevented only by intelligence warning from giant surveillance networks whose sources within territorial government had detected planning for elimination of federal officers whose investigation was threatening to expose conspiracy that reached into congressional offices and federal agencies, where corporate influence had been purchased through methods that violated national security as well as territorial law. The attack that was thwarted would have involved multiple professional killers, whose success would have sent message to other federal officials about consequences of investigating corporate activities too thoroughly. The escalation that followed the failed assassination transformed territorial law enforcement crisis into federal emergency that required military intervention to protect constitutional government from criminal conspiracy that threatened democratic institutions throughout Western territories, where corporate influence had reached levels that made honest governance impossible through normal political processes. When President Grant personally authorized military action to protect federal officials and civilian witnesses whose testimony was essential for prosecuting crimes that threatened national interests, both Julien and Captain Dubois understood that their personal conflict had become part of broader struggle between democracy and corporate oligarchy that would determine American political development for generations, whose freedom depended on establishing precedents that protected citizen rights against concentrated wealth and political corruption. The arrival of federal troops in Silver City was conducted with precision that demonstrated military understanding of urban warfare and anti-insurgency operations, while their immediate establishment of martial law provided legal framework for protecting witnesses and gathering evidence without interference from corrupt territorial officials whose authority was suspended pending federal investigation of conspiracy that threatened constitutional government throughout Western territories. The soldiers who took control of key installations and communication systems were veterans whose experience with hostile populations had been gained through Civil War service and frontier campaigns that prepared them for resistance from criminal organizations whose resources exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities. The mass arrests that followed military intervention included territorial officials whose corruption had been documented through financial records and communications that federal investigators had obtained through cooperation with intelligence networks whose capabilities exceeded anything conventional law enforcement possessed, while corporate executives who had purchased political influence through illegal payments found themselves facing federal charges that carried penalties including death for treason and conspiracy against constitutional government. The speed and scope of federal action prevented destruction of evidence and elimination of witnesses, while also demonstrating federal commitment to pursuing justice regardless of political pressure or economic disruption. The safe houses that were established for protecting giant families during federal operations required coordination between military forces and community leaders whose cooperation was essential for maintaining security while also respecting cultural autonomy that legal precedents needed to establish for protecting minority rights against future persecution by hostile governments or corporate interests. The temporary relocation that was accomplished through military logistics provided security while also allowing federal investigators to document living conditions and cultural practices that challenged assumptions about primitive peoples whose technological and social development exceeded conventional civilization in areas involving environmental harmony and community cooperation. The testimony that began emerging from protected witnesses revealed conspiracy scope that exceeded anything congressional oversight committees had previously investigated, involving systematic corruption that reached into federal agencies and congressional offices where corporate influence had been purchased through methods that violated national security laws while also threatening democratic institutions that constitutional government required for maintaining legitimate authority. The evidence that accumulated through military-protected investigation provided foundation for prosecutions that could transform American political development while establishing legal precedents for protecting citizen rights against concentrated wealth and corporate political influence. The political crisis that developed in Washington as evidence of congressional corruption became public knowledge, created opportunities for legislative reform that could prevent future corporate capture of democratic institutions, while President Grant's personal involvement in territorial intervention demonstrated federal commitment to constitutional principles that exceeded partisan politics or regional economic interests. When congressional hearings began exposing scope of corporate conspiracy that had reached into highest levels of federal government, both Julien and Captain Dubois understood that their resistance to local persecution had catalyzed national political transformation that could protect minority rights and environmental heritage for generations, whose freedom would be built on precedents that their courage had established through crisis that tested everything Americans claimed to believe about democracy and justice. The trials that began in federal court attracted national attention that transformed territorial corruption case into symbol of broader struggle between democratic values and corporate power that threatened constitutional government throughout America's expanding territories. While the evidence that was presented exceeded anything previous federal prosecutions had revealed about systematic criminal conspiracy involving territorial officials and mining company executives whose influence had reached into congressional offices and federal agencies. The defendants who faced charges including treason, conspiracy, and murder were represented by legal teams whose resources exceeded anything territorial courts had previously encountered, creating courtroom battles that tested federal justice system's capacity for prosecuting powerful criminals whose political connections had previously provided immunity from legal consequences. The testimony that federal prosecutors presented included evidence from giant intelligence networks whose capabilities had been hidden from public knowledge until criminal conspiracy had forced their revelation. While the documents and communications that were introduced as evidence demonstrated scope of corporate influence that exceeded anything congressional oversight committees had imagined possible through supposedly legitimate business activities. The financial records that connected territorial officials with mining company executives through transactions that could only be explained as payment for illegal services provided foundation for prosecutions that could result in death sentences for treason and conspiracy against constitutional government. The defense strategy that was employed by corporate legal teams involved challenging evidence sources and questioning federal authority to prosecute territorial crimes, while their attempts to portray giant witnesses as unreliable due to their non-human nature created constitutional questions about citizenship and civil rights that would influence American law for generations, whose freedom would be determined by precedents established through cases that exceeded simple criminal prosecution. The legal arguments that developed during testimony created framework for constitutional protections that could prevent future persecution of minority populations, while also establishing federal authority over territorial governance when local corruption threatened national interests. The political pressure that was generated by trial publicity included attempts to influence federal judges through congressional intervention and media campaigns that portrayed territorial development as essential for national progress, while characterizing federal prosecution as government overreach that threatened legitimate business activities and regional economic development. The assassination attempts against federal prosecutors and key witnesses demonstrated criminal desperation that was making conspiracy members increasingly careless about maintaining legal pretenses, while also providing additional evidence of systematic criminality that strengthened prosecution cases rather than weakening federal resolve. The verdicts that were delivered after months of testimony established legal precedents for federal prosecution of territorial corruption, while also providing constitutional protections for minority populations whose rights had been violated through systematic persecution by criminal conspiracies that exceeded local law enforcement capabilities. When corporate executives and territorial officials were convicted of treason and conspiracy with sentences that included death and life imprisonment, both Julien and Captain Dubois understood that justice had been achieved through methods that exceeded individual courage or community resistance, requiring federal intervention and constitutional protections that their struggle had helped establish for protecting democracy against concentrated wealth and political corruption. The federal legislation that was enacted following successful prosecutions created legal framework for protecting giant communities, while also establishing environmental protections that prevented future corporate exploitation of natural resources that belonged to entire populations rather than private interests whose profit margins required destroying irreplaceable natural heritage. The recognition of giant citizenship rights exceeded anything minority populations had previously achieved, while their legal status as equals rather than protected wards created precedents for civil rights that would influence American constitutional development for generations, whose freedom would be built on principles that their struggle had established through crisis that tested democratic institutions. The resettlement programs that were created through federal funding provided opportunities for giant families to establish permanent communities in territories where their cultural autonomy could be maintained, while also participating in broader American society through economic and political activities that utilized their unique capabilities for sustainable development and environmental restoration. The lands that were designated for their use included areas where mining and logging had created environmental damage that conventional restoration methods couldn't repair, but which giant knowledge and techniques could heal through processes that combined ancient wisdom with modern scientific understanding. The educational programs that were established to share giant knowledge with broader populations created opportunities for cultural exchange that benefited everyone willing to learn from people whose technological and social development exceeded conventional civilization in areas involving environmental harmony and community cooperation. The universities that were founded through cooperation between giant communities and federal education programs became centers for research that revolutionized understanding of sustainable development while also providing training for practitioners whose skills could address environmental challenges that industrial civilization had created through methods that ignored ecological relationships. The economic development that resulted from giant integration exceeded all projections, as their knowledge of natural processes and sustainable technologies created innovations that provided prosperity without environmental destruction that characterized conventional industrial development. The businesses that were established through cooperation between giant entrepreneurs and conventional investors demonstrated possibilities for economic growth that didn't require depleting natural resources or exploiting human labor through methods that enriched corporate owners while destroying community welfare and environmental health that future generations would inherit. The personal happiness that Julien and Captain Dubois found together represented triumph of love over circumstances that had seemed impossible to overcome through individual action, while their marriage symbolized possibility for cooperation between different peoples, whose diversity was strength rather than threat, when approached through understanding rather than fear that characterized initial responses to change that challenged comfortable assumptions about familiar ways of life. Their family, that included both human and giant children, whose upbringing in integrated communities created next generation of citizens whose attitudes toward diversity would prevent future persecution while building social foundations for genuinely inclusive democracy. The backlash that developed against federal intervention and giant integration was organized by corporate interests whose losses from environmental regulation and territorial reform exceeded anything previous government actions had cost private enterprises, while their campaign to reverse legal protections included political pressure that reached into congressional offices and federal agencies, where influence could still be purchased through methods that were more sophisticated than previous corruption, but equally threatening to democratic institutions. The propaganda that was disseminated through newspapers and political organizations portrayed giant communities as threats to American values and territorial development while ignoring evidence of their contributions to environmental restoration and sustainable economic growth. The violence that began with isolated attacks on integrated communities escalated into systematic terrorism that was designed to force giant populations back into hiding, while also intimidating federal officials whose enforcement of civil rights protections was preventing corporate expansion into territories where environmental regulations were blocking profitable development projects. The perpetrators of terrorist attacks included former territorial officials whose careers had been destroyed by federal prosecutions, as well as professional killers whose services were available to anyone willing to pay for elimination of obstacles to business operations that required destroying environmental protections and minority rights. The federal response to terrorist campaign was complicated by jurisdictional disputes and political pressure from congressional representatives whose districts included corporate interests that were financing anti-giant activities while claiming that terrorism was spontaneous grassroots resistance to government overreach rather than organized criminal conspiracy designed to reverse constitutional protections through violence that legal methods couldn't achieve. The investigation that was launched to identify terrorist networks required cooperation between military forces and civilian law enforcement agencies whose capabilities were being tested by opponents whose resources exceeded anything previous domestic terrorism had involved. The intelligence that was gathered through giant surveillance networks revealed terrorist organization that exceeded anything federal authorities had imagined possible, involving financial networks and political connections that reached into highest levels of corporate and government hierarchies, where influence was being used to coordinate activities that violated federal law while claiming constitutional protection for legitimate political opposition to government policies. The scope of criminal conspiracy that investigation uncovered made clear that democratic institutions were facing systematic assault by forces whose commitment to destroying constitutional government exceeded anything previous domestic threats had involved. The assassination attempt against President Grant was prevented only through intelligence warning from giant sources whose capabilities had been proven through previous success in exposing corporate conspiracy, while the planned attack would have triggered military coup that could have destroyed constitutional government while establishing corporate oligarchy that would have eliminated democratic institutions throughout American territories. When federal investigation revealed that assassination plot was part of broader conspiracy to overthrow constitutional government, both Julien and Captain Dubois understood that their personal struggle had become part of existential conflict that would determine whether democracy or corporate oligarchy would control American political development for future generations, whose freedom depended on preventing corporate capture of democratic institutions. The evidence that emerged from federal investigation of the assassination plot revealed corporate conspiracy that exceeded anything previous intelligence had uncovered, involving systematic planning for overthrow of constitutional government through methods that combined political corruption with military force while utilizing terrorist organizations to create chaos that would justify suspension of civil rights and democratic institutions. The documents that were seized during military raids on corporate headquarters demonstrated coordination between business leaders and foreign governments whose intervention in American politics was designed to prevent democratic development that could influence political evolution throughout world territories where constitutional government threatened traditional oligarchy. The military response that President Grant authorized exceeded anything previous domestic crisis had required, involving deployment of federal troops throughout territories where corporate terrorist networks were operating, while also establishing martial law that provided legal framework for protecting constitutional government against systematic assault by forces whose resources exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities. The coordination between military forces and giant intelligence networks created unprecedented domestic security operations that could counter terrorist activities while also gathering evidence for prosecutions that would eliminate criminal conspiracies threatening democratic institutions. The battle that erupted when terrorist forces attempted to prevent federal arrests of corporate conspirators involved military engagements that exceeded anything territorial conflicts had previously required, as professional armies that were financed by corporate resources attempted to establish independent territories where constitutional government would be replaced by oligarchy that served business interests rather than citizen welfare. The combat that raged throughout several territories demonstrated that corporate conspiracy had reached levels that threatened national survival, while also revealing capabilities that federal military forces needed for protecting democracy against domestic enemies whose power exceeded foreign threats. The siege of Silver City became symbolic confrontation between democratic values and corporate oligarchy, as terrorist forces that controlled territorial government attempted to prevent federal authorities from completing prosecutions that would expose conspiracy reaching into highest levels of American politics, while also establishing precedents for protecting constitutional government against concentrated wealth and political corruption. The civilian casualties that resulted from urban warfare created national tragedy that focused public attention on corporate responsibility for violence that exceeded anything previous domestic terrorism had involved. The breakthrough that ended corporate resistance came when giant intelligence networks provided information about financial resources and political connections that were sustaining terrorist activities, while federal forces simultaneously captured communications equipment that revealed coordination between domestic conspirators and foreign governments whose intervention was designed to prevent American democratic development from influencing political evolution in territories where constitutional government threatened traditional oligarchy. When federal troops finally broke terrorist resistance and captured remaining corporate conspirators, both Julien and Captain Dubois understood that democracy had survived existential threat through methods that would influence American political development for generations, whose freedom would be protected by institutions that their struggle had helped preserve through crisis that tested everything the Constitution claimed to guarantee about citizen rights and democratic governance. The trials that followed the suppression of corporate rebellion attracted international attention that transformed American territorial crisis into global symbol of democratic resistance against oligarchy. While the evidence that was presented exceeded anything previous prosecutions had revealed about systematic conspiracy to overthrow constitutional government through methods that combined political corruption with military force and foreign intervention. The defendants who faced charges of treason included corporate executives whose wealth had previously provided immunity from legal consequences, as well as former territorial officials whose corruption had been exposed through federal investigation that demonstrated scope of criminal activity exceeding anything congressional oversight had previously uncovered. The testimony that was provided by giant witnesses created legal precedents for civil rights that exceeded anything previous minority protections had achieved, while their detailed knowledge of corporate activities and terrorist operations provided evidence that federal prosecutors needed for establishing criminal conspiracy that reached into highest levels of American politics and business. The documents and communications that were introduced during trials demonstrated systematic planning for overthrow of democratic institutions, while also revealing foreign government involvement in domestic terrorism that violated international law as well as constitutional protections. The verdicts that were delivered after extensive deliberation established legal foundations for protecting democracy against concentrated wealth and political corruption, while the sentences that were imposed included death penalties for treason and life imprisonment for conspiracy that demonstrated federal commitment to constitutional principles, regardless of political pressure or economic disruption that prosecutions might cause. The executions that followed conviction of corporate conspirators served notice that American democratic institutions would be protected against domestic enemies whose resources exceeded foreign threats, while also establishing precedents for federal authority over territorial governance when local corruption threatened national interests. The legislation that was enacted following successful prosecutions created constitutional protections that exceeded anything previous civil rights measures had achieved, while environmental regulations that were established through giant knowledge prevented future corporate exploitation of natural resources that belonged to entire populations, rather than private interests, whose profit margins required destroying irreplaceable natural heritage. The federal agencies that were created to enforce new protections demonstrated government commitment to preventing future corporate capture of democratic institutions, while also providing framework for protecting minority rights against hostile populations or corrupt officials. The memorial that was erected to honor everyone who had died during struggle against corporate oligarchy included recognition of Isabelle Rousseau's sacrifice as catalyst for resistance that saved democratic institutions, while the inscription that was carved in granite provided permanent reminder that constitutional government required constant vigilance against forces whose wealth and power could corrupt political institutions unless citizen courage and federal authority combined to protect democracy against domestic enemies whose resources exceeded anything foreign threats had ever possessed. The reconciliation programs that were established to address violence and corruption that had divided territorial communities created opportunities for healing that exceeded anything previous civil conflicts had achieved. While federal funding for reconstruction provided resources for rebuilding infrastructure and social institutions that corporate terrorism had destroyed through systematic attacks on civilian populations whose only crime had been supporting constitutional government and minority rights. The mediation services that were provided through cooperation between federal authorities and giant communities demonstrated possibilities for peaceful resolution of conflicts that had previously seemed to require military intervention for protecting democratic institutions. The Truth Commission that was created to document corporate crimes and government corruption provided comprehensive accounting of systematic violations that had threatened constitutional government while also establishing historical record that could prevent future conspiracies through public knowledge of methods that oligarchy used for capturing democratic institutions. The testimony that was gathered from victims and witnesses created emotional impact that exceeded legal proceedings while also providing educational resources that could be used for teaching future generations about costs of political corruption and environmental destruction that private interests could inflict on entire populations. The reparations that were provided to communities that had suffered from corporate terrorism exceeded anything previous government compensation had offered. While environmental restoration that was accomplished through giant knowledge and federal funding demonstrated possibilities for healing damage that conventional methods couldn't repair through processes that combined ancient wisdom with modern scientific understanding. The economic development that resulted from sustainable technologies created prosperity that benefited everyone willing to participate in integrated communities where diversity was valued as strength rather than feared as threat to social stability. The educational exchanges that were established between giant communities and conventional institutions created cultural integration that benefited all participants while preserving unique heritage that enriched American civilization through contributions that exceeded anything assimilation policies had achieved through forced conformity to dominant cultural patterns. The children who grew up in integrated communities developed attitudes toward diversity that would prevent future persecution while also creating social foundations for genuinely inclusive democracy that could protect minority rights through understanding rather than legal requirements alone. The marriage that united Julien and Captain Dubois was celebrated throughout reformed territories as symbol of love, triumphant over obstacles that had seemed insurmountable when faced by individuals whose courage exceeded their resources. While their personal happiness represented possibilities for cooperation between different peoples, whose diversity was strength rather than threat when approached through understanding rather than fear that characterized initial responses to change, challenging comfortable assumptions about familiar ways of life. The university that was established through cooperation between giant communities and federal education programs became center for research that revolutionized understanding of sustainable development, while also providing training for practitioners whose skills could address environmental challenges that industrial civilization had created through methods that ignored ecological relationships requiring harmony rather than domination for long-term survival. The innovations that emerged from collaborative research exceeded anything conventional science had achieved, while also preserving ancient knowledge that would have been lost through persecution and forced assimilation that destroyed heritage rather than building bridges between different ways of understanding natural world and human relationships. The political influence that giant communities achieved through voting rights and economic leverage created power that exceeded anything minority populations had previously possessed. while their commitment to using influence for community benefit rather than sectarian advantage demonstrated wisdom that exceeded conventional political behavior and provided examples of leadership that prioritized public welfare over private gain that motivated most political activity in democratic systems claiming to serve citizen interests while actually serving wealthy elites whose corruption threatened constitutional government. The environmental restoration that was accomplished through giant knowledge exceeded anything conventional methods could have achieved. While federal protections that were established through their political influence prevented future corporate exploitation of natural resources that belonged to entire populations rather than private interests, whose profit margins required destroying irreplaceable natural heritage that future generations would inherit as legacy of current decisions about development priorities and resource allocation that would determine quality of life for centuries beyond present political considerations. The next generation that was growing up in integrated communities included children whose education prepared them for leadership roles in expanding American society where diversity would be valued as strength rather than feared as threat to social stability, while their attitudes toward cooperation and environmental stewardship would prevent future conflicts through understanding that exceeded legal requirements or political enforcement of civil rights that constitutional amendments had established through struggle that tested democratic institutions against concentrated wealth and political corruption. The legacy that would endure long after individual participants had died included institutions and values that would serve democratic civilization for generations, whose freedom would be protected by precedents that courage and sacrifice had established through crisis that tested everything Americans claimed to believe about constitutional government and civil rights, that required constant defense against forces preferring control to freedom and uniformity to diversity that strengthened rather than threatened social stability and national security. 20 years after that fateful day when Julien had discovered Isabelle's body hanging in Perdition Wells, he stood once again in the ghost town that had been transformed into Memorial Park, where visitors could learn about struggles that had shaped American democracy while honoring people whose sacrifice had protected constitutional government against domestic enemies whose wealth and power had exceeded foreign threats to national security and citizen rights. The sign that had once proclaimed "No man rides free" had been replaced with monument recognizing everyone who had died in struggle against corporate oligarchy, while the inscription carved in granite provided permanent reminder that freedom required constant vigilance and occasional sacrifice from people whose commitment to justice exceeded their concern for personal safety. The ceremony that was being conducted to commemorate establishment of civil rights protections exceeded anything previous minority recognition had achieved. While President Hayes's speech about constitutional principles and democratic values demonstrated federal commitment to protecting diversity against hostile populations or corrupt officials whose influence could threaten institutions that citizen courage had preserved through crisis, that tested everything the Constitution guaranteed about equality and justice. The crowd that gathered for memorial services included survivors from both human and giant communities whose cooperation had created model for inclusive democracy that other territories were adopting for addressing similar challenges. The school that had been built where the old Saloon once stood was graduating students whose education combined ancient wisdom with modern knowledge, while preparing them for leadership roles in expanding American society where diversity was valued as strength rather than feared as threat to social order and national security that depended on cooperation rather than conformity for achieving prosperity and justice that benefited entire populations rather than privileged elites whose corruption had been eliminated through federal intervention and constitutional protections. Marie Dubois Beaumont, now serving as territorial representative in Congress, delivered address about progress that had been achieved through struggle, while also acknowledging work that remained for protecting democracy against forces that preferred control to freedom and uniformity, to diversity that strengthened rather than threatened American institutions and values that required constant defense through citizen participation and federal enforcement of constitutional protections that previous generations had established through sacrifice and determination that exceeded personal concerns about safety or comfort. As sunset painted the desert landscape in colors that reminded everyone present of beauty that could be preserved through wisdom, rather than consumed through greed, Julien and Marie watched their grandchildren play in gardens that had been created where Perdition Wells had once symbolized failure and abandonment. Understanding that their love story had somehow grown into blessing, that transformed entire territories through demonstrations that the most powerful forces in the universe were not wealth or violence, but compassion and courage that could overcome any obstacle when people chose understanding over fear and cooperation over competition that damaged rather than strengthened human relationships and community welfare. The ghost town that had once represented death and despair had become symbol of hope and renewal, proving that even the most desolate places could bloom with life when watered by tears of joy and tended by hands that chose to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, to welcome strangers rather than fear difference that enriched rather than threatened the magnificent diversity that made America strong enough to protect freedom for all its children, regardless of size or color or creed, in territories where justice finally rode free, because people had learned that no one was truly free until everyone was free to live and love and dream in peace that passed understanding, but which could be achieved through faith that moved mountains and love that conquered all.